Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of this book, Writing Effective Arguments. Let's take a look at what's in the book and let's get an idea as to why you might need what's in this book. So a little bit about me first up. I held an executive level position in the Australian Public Service where I was writing cases, making decisions on cases that were put to me, analysing business cases, things of that sort. I also worked for over a decade as a consultant and trainer to the Australian government and also major private companies, teaching and training in advanced writing skills. And in my capacity as a business owner, I've also been responsible for writing a very large number of tender responses where we were seeking work, we were seeking training work particularly, and I have an outstanding success rate in gaining business via those persuasive arguments that I was putting forward. Now, why would you need the ability to write strong written arguments? Well, there are so many examples. If you are writing a job application, you are putting forward an argument that you are best for that job. It's a persuasive argument. You may not have thought of it in that way. If you're writing a tender response, why should we get the work that is on offer? You are writing a persuasive argument about why you are best for that particular work that's available. If you're writing a business case, we should get this new software, we should buy this new plant, we should change a process that we are currently using. You are writing a persuasive argument yet again. And if you're lobbying for an action to be taken, let's not do it in that way in the future. Again, it's a persuasive written argument. And if you approach each of those tasks on the basis that it is an argument, then there's a bunch of strategies that you can put into place to make your argument far more watertight and convincing. Now, in the book, I cover a 6-step process for writing persuasive arguments. The first one is, what is your proposition? What is it that you want your reader to agree to? And then what evidence can you put forward for that specific proposition? And furthermore, what evidence can you put forward that will be persuasive for the particular reader you are writing for? I then look at how you can go about developing the key points in the argument. We look at 5 characteristics of good arguments, and then we do an assessment. How effective is your argument? How effective is your argument using what is called a KP and F approach to analysis? We cover argument mapping. 2 different types of argument mapping are covered in the book. I'm going to cover those briefly in a moment. And then we look at what are the most effective writing styles to use in an argument. Should you write deductively or inductively? And much of that depends on the audience that you are writing for, whether they're skeptical or whether they're likely to be in agreement. Now, I can't cover all of those processes in this short video, so let's just look at argument mapping in a bit more detail. It's a wonderful tool that puts together the bones of the argument, the bare bones of the argument. It allows you to look more carefully at what it is you're putting forward, see weaknesses, see strengths, and see holes. 2 different types of argument maps. The first one's overall argument map. Everything that you're going to be putting in to the argument, both supporting the proposition and potentially arguing against the proposition, the weaknesses of your argument. And the second argument map is what's called a sequential argument map. How do I get my reader on the train and then take them from station to station to station until we have ended up at the destination that you are trying to persuade your reader of? Let's look firstly at overall argument maps. Now, lots of boxes on the screen, aren't there? But an overall argument map has 3 fundamental areas. In the middle, it has what is the proposition you are putting forward. We should buy pizza tonight might be a proposition. In this case, the proposition in the middle of the argument map is this one. Australia should substantially increase its population. And of course, you can put in whatever country you want. Directly above that, we have a series of points that do not support that proposition. Now, you don't necessarily put these forward in the written argument, but you are aware that they are weaknesses in your argument that you have to actually cover off or be ready to respond to if the audience actually questions you on that basis. So we have proposition, and then we have weaknesses of that proposition, evidence against that proposition, if you like, and then below that, we have evidence for that proposition. Don't worry about these other boxes at the moment. So let's have a look at some of these. Australia should substantially increase its population is the proposition. Now, what's a weakness of that proposition? And if we go up here, increased population would cause environmental catastrophe. Wow, that's a weakness of that proposition. Can't have infinite growth, can we? Australia cannot feed an increased population. Okay, not sure how valid that is. We might need to do some more research. Quality of life would be reduced for all Australians. The GNP would be spread more thinly, in other words. And a moral argument, Australia should be feeding a hungry world rather than a larger population. Now, all of these might be weaknesses that your audience comes up with, criticisms that your audience comes up with of the proposition that you are putting forward, and so you must be ready for those. You must have thought those through, in many cases address those in the written argument you are putting forward. All right, what are reasons that support the proposition? Economic growth requires a larger population. Therefore, Australia should substantially increase its population. An ageing population requires more young people. Therefore, Australia should substantially increase its population. Incidentally, one assumes by natural increase, because you're going to get more young people by natural increase rather than migration. The defence of the country needs a larger population. That's interesting. Immigration should increase, which will result in a population increase. But hold on, that's not a reason why Australia should substantially increase its population. That's a mechanism by which it could achieve it. So we can immediately cross that one out. That's not actually evidence for the proposition. Now you can see how when you develop an argument map in this skeletal form, you can see shortcomings so quickly of points that may have been suggested by a group or you in a brainstorm session that don't actually support the specific proposition. And then a moral and religious piece of evidence. Australia has a moral or religious obligation to populate. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, I don't agree with that. That sounds like a crock. But you think, well, who is this argument going to be addressed to? The audience of this argument may be receptive to the idea of a moral or religious obligation to populate. And so that's the other reason for using an overall argument map like this. You can test each piece of your evidence that you're putting forward against the likely reception by this specific audience you are writing for. Arguments are tailored to audiences, always. All right. What are these extra boxes down here? Well, each of these pieces of evidence for and each of these pieces of evidence against the proposition can be then expanded into their strengths and weaknesses. Let's take a look just at one. Economic growth requires a larger population. Well, why would that be the case? Well, because a larger population creates larger domestic demand. Oh, I see. Larger populations brings economies of scale. Goods can be produced at a smaller item per unit. But this one, immigrants from Asia promote regional trade. Hold on. Immigrants from Asia promote regional trade. How does that immediately lead to economic growth requiring a larger population? Surely any immigration would achieve that. So I think that's weak. I think that needs to be changed or taken out. And again, you can see in isolation the weaknesses and strengths of the argument you're putting forward. But economic growth requires a larger population. Doesn't that have some bit of weakness in there? After all, population growth and economic growth are unrelated. Oops. Now, if the audience takes on board the idea that population growth and economic growth are unrelated, then they're going to be completely dismissive of the piece of evidence that economic growth requires a larger population, aren't they? And there are countries in the world, of course, where population growth and economic growth are not being correlated at all. And this one, economic growth derives from the quality of resources, not sheer numbers. Oops. GNP per capita, GDP per capita maybe is not the best way of analysing things. Now, we could expand every single one of these points for and against into their strengths and weaknesses, and the only reason I haven't done so is you can't fit it on the slide, but you can see suddenly you're looking at all the strengths and weaknesses of all the points you are putting forward in your argument. Now, this is before writing any body text, before doing any drafting, page after page of drafts. This is looking at it in its isolation, the bare bones of the argument. And believe me, you can find the weaknesses, you can find the strengths, and you can find the holes in the argument you are putting forward, especially if you consider each in the context of the audience you are writing for, better in this way than any other way. Okay? When you are developing an argument, an overall argument map done in this manner allows you to see those things so much more clearly, to get feedback from others, for example, but also you don't get lost in all the writing and all the body text. You actually just see the key points. An overall argument map is a very, very powerful tool when you are developing what you want to have as a watertight argument. Okay, that's pretty good. So what's the other one? What's this sequential argument map? A sequential argument map shows the mechanism by which you take the reader through to the particular destination. And so in this case, you actually look at the last box first. In this case, it's addressing of selection criteria in a job application. And what they wanted us to show is I have a demonstrated capacity to communicate effectively. Now, you'll often see in people's job applications, they'll just parrot that and they'll say, I have a demonstrated capacity to communicate effectively. And of course, the selection panel looks at it and goes, well, where's the evidence? Where's the narrative? Why should I believe you? So be very careful not just to parrot selection criteria and say, yep, I can do it, because you've got to look at it from a skeptical point of view. Where's the evidence you can do it? Now, if we take this one, I have a demonstrated capacity to communicate effectively. I want to take the reader through until they agree with that statement in the context of me as the applicant for the job. So we've got to start quite a few steps back before that. Let's have a look how I did it here. I was tasked with designing publicity materials for a project. Okay, now the audience goes, okay, they're agreeing with you. You've got them on the train. I evaluated local community perception of the project. Yep, that sounds a reasonable thing that you'd do if you were designing publicity materials. Okay. I found that the project was perceived by the community in a negative light. All right, the audience will be coming along with you. Why would they have stopped at any of these stages? I then worked with subject matter experts to develop a message that would change community perception of the project. Oh, that's interesting. That's a good strategic approach to take. Yeah, you got me on board. Now, did it work? This was successful. Well, how do I know that? Surveys showed that the community was now positive about the project. Oh, wow, okay. Therefore, I have a demonstrated capacity to communicate effectively. Now, that's just one string of sequence, isn't it? You could have other strings of sequence that also lead to I have a demonstrated capacity to communicate effectively. Sometimes when people are talking to me about job applications, they'll say, oh, I've only got 500 words. I've only got 300 words for this selection criteria. And I'll say, yep, that's fine. It's fine if you take a sequential argument approach like this. You can actually have these almost as consecutive sentences. And if you add them up, there aren't many sentences there and there aren't many words there, are there? But it's convincing because you get your audience on board at the beginning of the sequence and then you take them step by step through to the outcome that they want to agree with. Overall argument maps, everything that's going into the argument. Sequential argument maps, a subset that shows the series of steps that you take your reader through. It's all in the book. Writing Effective Arguments by me. It's available now on Amazon. It has exercises in there, it has explanations in there, and it takes that 6-step approach, including coverage of those 2 different argument maps. If you write arguments at work, this is one book that you really need to have. Thank you.